Dove Audio presents National Public Radio's Malcolm X, Portrait of the Black Shining Prince.
I'm Alan Dershowitz. I introduced Malcolm X at the Harvard Law School Forum of December 16, 1964, just 2 months prior to his assassination. I was asked to introduce him because no one else would. There had been a threat on his life, and I saw it as a significant civil liberties issue that he would not otherwise be permitted to speak, so I gave the following introduction. Our speaker this evening was born Malcolm Little about 40 years ago in Omaha, Nebraska. Not much is known about his early life, except that in 1948 he joined the Black Muslim movement and adopted the last name of X, which he maintains today. Although still a Muslim, he has recently broken with the Black Muslim movement, where he served as chief minister. He is now chairman of an organization known as the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the description of which I shall leave to him. Now he prefers to be known as Brother Malcolm when he is speaking in a religious capacity, but as Malcolm X when he is speaking in a political capacity. The New York Times reported not very long ago that Malcolm X was the second most sought-after speaker on college and university campuses. The first was Barry Goldwater, Mr. Malcolm X.
From National Public Radio in Washington, a report originally broadcast on NPR's daily news and information program, All Things Considered.
For 5 years in the early 1960s, 5 turbulent years, an image, a tall, thin black man with reddish-brown hair, glasses, and a voice, insistent, often angry.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
Malcolm X died on this day 20 years ago, killed as he rose to address a crowd in New York City. On this anniversary, NPR's Gary Covino reviews the life of a man whose stature as a black leader and whose symbolic importance has continued to grow in the 2 decades since his death.
Malcolm X said repeatedly that he expected to die a violent death at an early age. When he stepped to the podium of the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem on February 21, 1965, he was a beleaguered figure. A week earlier, his house had been firebombed. His life had been threatened repeatedly by members of Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam. On this day, a disturbance broke out in the back of the hall. Some of Malcolm's bodyguards left the stage to break it up. At that moment, 3 men stood up in the audience and began firing. It was over in seconds, and Malcolm X was dead.
He raised his hand in a Muslim greeting, Salam Alaikum. At that point, I heard a rumbling behind me, and I turned around in my seat to see what it was. I saw 2 guys standing up, and the next thing, Malcolm had his hand up. He said, "Stay cool, stay calm." Just then, the gunfire went off, and his hand was up. I remember this. I turned around quickly, and the next thing I saw was Malcolm falling back in a dead faint. The chairs were being knocked over. There were screams. Everybody was in a mad confusion. I incidentally saw a guy running out, evidently one of the perpetrators running out, and he was shooting like a cowboy.
Vincent Harding is a historian at the University of Denver and the author of There is a River, The Black Struggle for Freedom in America. He says the details of Malcolm's life, especially as revealed in his autobiography, have helped make him an almost mythic figure.
I think he's seen as an example of the great human capacity for self-transformation and self-transcendence. A man who had gone down to the depths of the dregs of American life and society, who was able to, in a sense, recreate himself. That is a very important part of the mythos that's involved with Malcolm X.
He was a young man whose father had been killed.
Betty Shabazz is the widow of Malcolm X.
because the father was a Garveyite. The father believed in black and building black and buying black, and they should be able to go to school and have jobs similar to whites. But then the father was later killed in Lansing, Michigan, by the Klan. And so that Malcolm and all of his little sisters and brothers were separated. And the mother was from Grenada by way of Canada and didn't speak very good English and couldn't get a job and ended up in a psychiatric hospital, so that you can just imagine children without benefit of parents' guidance and directions.
The young boy known as Malcolm Little was shuttled from one family or state facility to another. He lived in an atmosphere of almost constant, even casual racism, typical of the 1920s and 30s. He bitterly recounted his early experiences in his autobiography, experiences which would set the tone for his pronouncements, years later, about whites and racism in America.
What makes the so-called Negro unable to stand on his own 2 feet? He has no self-confidence. He has no proud confidence in his own race. Because the white man destroyed your and my past, destroyed our knowledge of our culture. And by having destroyed it, now we don't know we have any achievement, any accomplishment. And as long as you can be convinced that you never did anything, you can never do anything.
Malcolm left Michigan while still in his teens, moving first to the Roxbury section of Boston, then to Harlem. Nicknamed Detroit Red, he became, in his own words, an animal, operating in the jungle world that white America created for the black man.
There was a time when we used to drool in the mouth over white people. We thought they were pretty because we were blind. We were dumb. We couldn't see them as they are. But since the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has come and taught us the religion of Islam, which has cleaned us up and made us so we can see for ourselves, now we can see that old pale thing to look exactly as he looked. That old pale thing. That old sickly looking thing. We don't want to be around that old pale thing. We don't want to integrate with that old pale thing. We don't want to sleep next to that old pale thing. No, we can do without it.
The black man by nature is divine.
Now, does this mean that the white man by nature is evil?
By nature, he is other than divine.
Well, now, does this mean that he's evil? Can he do good?
By nature, he is evil.
Malcolm joined Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam. He dropped his slave name, Little, and adopted the X that symbolized the unknown African name he had lost. In Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm found the father figure he'd been searching for since childhood, one even more militant than his own father had been. Malcolm had schooled himself in prison, and now used his education and talent as a speaker to recruit for the Muslims. Eventually, he was placed in charge of the mosque in New York City, and there he preached constantly, harshly, about the American blacks' loss of culture and identity.
So we have to have a new approach, a new appraisal. And this new appraisal and new approach has to be in tune with the reality of the conditions that we are in after having been thoroughly brainwashed by this blue-eyed white man. Some of them have brown eyes.
The Muslims believed that only by separating themselves from white society could they control their own lives. That meant owning their own businesses, forming their own schools, total rejection of white styles and attitudes, until the day when they could return to their African homeland. They rejected the civil rights movement's goal of integration with white society as demeaning and worthless.
No Negro leaders have fought for civil rights.
What do you mean
They have begged for civil rights. They have begged the white man for civil rights. They have begged the white man for freedom. And anytime you beg another man to set you free, you will never be free. Freedom is something that you have to do for yourselves. And until the American Negro lets the white man know that we are really, really ready and willing to pay the price that is necessary for freedom, our people will always be walking around here second-class citizens, or what you call 20th century slaves.
But civil rights workers throughout the South did pay a price as they marched and sat in. They were jailed, tear-gassed, and beaten, while the Muslims stood away. and Malcolm ridiculed the civil rights leaders and their tactics.
It's not so good to refer to what you're going to do as a sit-in. That right there castrates you. Right there it brings you down. What goes with it? Think of the image of someone sitting. An old woman can sit. An old man can sit. A chump can sit. A coward can sit. Anything can sit. Well, you and I have been sitting long enough, and it's time today for us to start doing some standing and some fighting to back that up.
Malcolm's criticisms were not well received within the civil rights movement, but historian Vincent Harding says they did eventually have an effect.
He was an agitator in one of the best senses of that word. Agitator in the sense of stirring up people to think about what was going on. I think that some of his attacks were unfair. I think that some of his attacks were more polemical than accurate. But I also think that he had clear justification for some of his criticism of the mainstream civil rights community, especially because of its failure to deal with the hard issues of the poor in the northern black communities.
We suffer political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation, all of them from the same enemy. The government has failed us. You can't deny that. Anytime you live in the 20th century and you walking around here singing, "We shall overcome," the government has failed. This is part of what's wrong with you. You do too much singing. Today it's time to stop singing and start swinging.
The news media quickly discovered Malcolm and largely portrayed him as an apostle of violence, a picture Vincent Harding says was much too simplistic.
I think that Malcolm was in the same situation as many prophets who do not predict that violence must come, but who call upon the society to look at what it is doing to sow the seeds of violence and to offer to open up to the society the possibility of another way.
There'll be a hot time in the old town. With regret, with great regret.
And of course, Malcolm was saying these things just before those summers of urban rebellion and fires broke out in this country. He knew, he understood, he felt what was going on. He did not call people to burn. He never did that. That was not his way. He was, at heart, a tremendously gentle and compassionate man. But what he was saying was, what you sow, you have to reap, whether as an individual or as a society. And he knew, as Martin King knew, that this is one of the most violent societies in the world.
Looks like it might be the year of the ballot or the bullet. Because Negroes have listened to the trickery and the lies and the false promises of the white man now for too long, and they're fed up. They've become disenchanted. They've become disillusioned. They've become dissatisfied. And all of this has built up frustrations in the black community that makes the black community throughout America today more explosive than all of the atomic bombs the Russians can ever invent. Whenever you got a racial powder keg sitting in your lap, you're in more trouble than if you had an atomic powder keg sitting in your lap. When a racial powder keg goes off, it doesn't care who it knocks out the way. Understand this, it's dangerous.
By 1963, Malcolm was in great demand around the country as a speaker. He and Barry Goldwater were the two most requested lecturers on college campuses. As Malcolm put it, it seemed like everyone wanted to get their close look at the fiery Negro. But in December, Malcolm was suspended from speaking by Elijah Muhammad, after he said the assassination of President Kennedy was a case of chickens coming home to roost. that white violence had now struck down even the white president. Malcolm would insist for the rest of his life that he wasn't gloating, but that's the way his remarks were interpreted. For years, he'd been used to controversy, but the furor over these remarks seemed to shake him.
What did you say, Malcolm?
Well, I said the same thing that everybody says, that his assassination was the result of the climate of hate. But only I said the chickens came home to roost, and which means the same thing.
You did not say that you were glad the president was killed.
No, that's what the press said. What would I look like saying that I'm glad the president was killed?
Malcolm broke with the Muslims early in 1964 because he'd been suspended, because of rivalries and power struggles within the Muslim inner circle, and because of his disapproval of Elijah Muhammad's personal life. He separated from the man he had once regarded as a father, and their relations would grow increasingly hostile. But now Malcolm began to expand his political thinking. While still invoking his mentor's name, he moved away from the isolation of the Muslims.
I am and always will be a Muslim. My religion is Islam. I still believe that Mr. Muhammad's analysis of the problem is the most realistic, and that his solution is the best one. This means that I, too, believe that the best solution is complete separation, with our people going back home, that is, to our African homeland. But separation back to Africa is still a long-range program, and while it is yet to materialize, 22 million of our people who are still here in America need better food, better clothing, better housing, better education, and better jobs right now.
Malcolm decided that the situation of blacks in America would only begin to change when it was put on the international agenda.
The entire civil rights program has to be expanded from the level of civil rights to the level of human rights. When you take it from the level of civil rights and put it on the level of human rights, you internationalize the problem. And when you internationalize it, you open the gate for support from every nation on this planet who is for the human rights of mankind. The civil rights program must be expanded to the level of human rights so that our case can be taken before the United Nations. The civil rights movement has given Uncle Sam since 1954 to implement the desegregation decision of the Supreme Court. Uncle Sam is so crooked that he hasn't even implemented the decision of the highest court he has. So since you and I can't get justice from Uncle Sam in his court, let's take Uncle Sam before the world court.
Malcolm insisted that African nations would champion the cause of American blacks.
And once the lines of communication have been established, and our African brothers can stretch forth their hands and reach us, and we can stretch forth our hands and reach them, why, there's nothing that this blue-eyed man in this country will be able to do to you and me successfully from that day onward.
Malcolm had already formed a political group called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Now he journeyed to Africa to meet with the leaders of emerging nations, and to Saudi Arabia to make the Hajj, the traditional pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. Malcolm's widow, Betty Shabazz.
When he went to Mecca, he went through that ritual, which is almost like a tea training, but more. It puts you in touch with yourself and others. It allows for inclusion of others where they were prevented before.
Malcolm wrote back to his wife and to his followers in America about the Mecca journey, which was a major turning point in his life, and his words were noted back home.
I think what happened was that America began to listen, not totally, but partially to him, because he had broke with Elijah Muhammad. Because the humanity that was there then was there before.
Today I'm speaking for myself. Formerly I spoke for Elijah Muhammad. And everything I said was, Elijah Muhammad teaches us thus and so. I'm speaking now from what I think, from what I have seen, from what I have analyzed, and the conclusions that I have reached. If I judge a man by his conscious behavior, I am not a racist, I don't subscribe to any of the tenets of racism. It's not a case of being good or bad blacks and whites. It's a case of being good or bad human beings. And this is what I had to become aware of on my pilgrimage to Mecca. I could see then that there are many white people in this country who will side with the Negro in whatever he has to do to protect himself.
Returning to the United States, Malcolm said, for the first time, that he'd be willing to work alongside sympathetic whites, although he still maintained they shouldn't join his organization. And he extended an olive branch to mainstream civil rights figures.
I'm not out to fight other Negro leaders or other Negro organizations. We must find a common approach, a common solution to a common problem. As of this minute, I have forgotten everything bad that the other leaders have said about me, and I pray they can also forget the many bad things that I have said about them. The problem facing our people here in America is bigger than all the other personal or organizational differences. Therefore, as leaders, we must stop worrying about the threat that we seem to think we pose to each other's personal prestige and concentrate our united efforts toward solving the unending hurt that is being done daily to our people here in America.
Historian Vincent Harding.
He went down to Selma at the invitation primarily of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and there, while Martin King was in jail, spoke to Coretta King and made it very clear to her that he was not in any way as opposed to and as different from Martin and his concerns as it would appear in the public media. He said he simply wanted people to know that if they did not deal with Martin King, they would have to deal with the kind of anger and the kind of vehemence that Malcolm X represented.
And while he continued to call for a revolution with that same vehemence, Malcolm seemed to offer the hope that this country could avoid a final catastrophe.
America today finds herself in a unique situation. Historically, revolutions are bloody. Oh, yes, they are. But America is in a unique position. She's the only country in history in a position actually to become involved in a bloodless revolution. All she's got to do is give the black man in this country everything that's doing. Everything.
Despite his new direction in late 1964 and early 1965, Malcolm's message was not reaching as wide an audience, nor gaining as sympathetic a hearing as he would have liked. Malcolm had always been a polarizer, not a unifier, and was still largely viewed that way. His own political organization had been left disorganized and largely ineffective by his prolonged trip to Africa. And his feud with the Muslims escalated, until finally he was gunned down by men identified with Elijah Muhammad's movement. According to historian Vincent Harding, it took Malcolm's death to finally make him as effective a figure for blacks in this country as he had wanted to be.
He became, in a sense, available much more fully to people who were seeking this kind of focus on solidarity among black people. And I think that his spirit was then called upon by many, many people who were working for this kind of unity and this kind of solidarity. His role was, in a sense, magnified. He became much more of a unifier after his death than before.
And that was the final transformation of Malcolm X, who was laid to rest 20 years ago.
Here, at this final hour, in this quiet place, Harlem has come to bid farewell to one of its brightest hopes, extinguished now and gone from us forever. Many will ask what Harlem finds to honor in this stormy, controversial, and bold young captain, and we will smile, and we will answer and say unto them, did you ever talk to Brother Malcolm? Did he ever touch you? Did you have him smile at you? Did you ever really listen to him? Did he ever do a mean thing? Was he ever himself associated with violence or any public disturbance? For if you did, you would know him. And if you knew him, you would know why we must honor him. Malcolm was our manhood, our living black manhood, That was his meaning to his people. And in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves. And we will know him then for what he was and is, a prince, our black shining prince who didn't hesitate to die because he loved us so.
Actor Ossie Davis speaking at the funeral of Malcolm X, who died 20 years ago today. Our profile prepared by NPR's Gary Covino.
The report you just heard was originally broadcast on NPR, National Public Radio.